Well, we're thrilled to be here. Thank you guys so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a recovering lawyer, as they say in the practice, so lawyer to journalist. So I think the only thing left for me is politician.
There's time.
There's still time. I'm thrilled to be here with Eric, who got here briskly on time about a minute ago, so he's just catching his breath. And we're thrilled to be here for you guys to have a quick chat on some of the challenges. And I wanted to start with you. Would you like some water?
That would be great.
You've been at Morgan Stanley since 2006, and spent 11 years now. Tell us a little bit about some of the challenges and how those challenges have changed. What challenges are new, what things have stayed, what you're grappling with now, just how that landscape has evolved.
Wow, that's a big question. It's totally different. The building's the same. I show up at work at 1585 Broadway. Actually didn't work at 1585 Broadway, but spent a lot of time there. So the building's the same. And at its core, what pieces of Morgan Stanley do are the same. Sales and trading it's not the same, but the core function is the same. And investment banking, that's largely the same. Our wealth management business has over doubled. But how we prosecute our business and our interaction with our newest stakeholder is totally different. So when I first showed up at Morgan Stanley in 2006, we would think about three significant stakeholders: our clients. This is not in any particular order, although it is an order. Our clients, our shareholders, and our employees. Like those were the three big stakeholders. Now it's those three plus our global regulators. Mm-hmm. And they are as important as the other three stakeholders. They have the keys. The license to operate is predicated, of course, on being in solid standing with your global regulators, of which there are many. And in the U.S., when I showed up, the SEC was our principal consolidated supervisor globally. It was very light touch regulation at a place like Morgan Stanley. Now the Fed is our consolidated supervisor, as it is for all the large banks. They have what they call continuous and constant on-site presence of banking regulators. The OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We have two banks, which a lot of people don't know, but we have sort of two banks embedded within our business. We don't have any branches or ATMs, but we run two large banks. The OCC is on site all the time. They work together, kind of, sort of, once in a while. We still have the SEC, the CFTC, FINRA, the FDIC, all the state regulators. And then when you leave the United States, we have it used to be the Financial Services Administration in London. Now it's the PRA, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and the FCA, and then the list just goes on and on. So so the job is way different. Plus the expectations of a legal and compliance function have evolved significantly over the years. Morgan Stanley is the last of the big banks that still has legal and compliance in one division, which is actually how I think it should be. And we work kind of hand in glove with a shared mission. That's different than most of the other banks. A lot of them pushed to separate legal and compliance by their regulators for reasons that might have been idiosyncratic to that particular bank and a particular problem at that bank. But then the gospel has become separate legal and compliance, which I think is counterproductive to all four stakeholders' ultimate goals. So we do that differently at Morgan Stanley. But the expectations for compliance and the other kind of non-legal but legal-ish functions are totally different post-crisis. People talk about first line, second line, third line of defense in a much more kind of foundational way when they think about banks than they did before the crisis. So an enormous amount has changed. You need look not much further than how my boss, the CEO, spends his time. Yep. And how much time he spends with global regulators relative to John Mack, his predecessor, would have before. And it's true for all the bank CEOs.
Let's talk full disclosure. Before I was at Bloomberg, I was at the Financial Times in London for many years. I was the investment banking reporter during the crisis.
You covered us.
And I want to talk just a little bit about what you pick up there and what you said about compliance, but also the behavioral shifts that have to go on internally, particularly with employees as well, and how that dynamic changed, and how you've managed an operation to partner with employees to the benefit of another one of your stakeholders, shareholders, obviously, but making that cultural shift of working with not being seen as the enforcer, of making it a voluntary, proactive part of people's everyday work lives, as opposed to a negative, a push top-down, pushing down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that gets a little bit to this this separation of legal compliance. You know, a lot of regulators say, look, the lawyers, which I'm sure there are lots in this room, you're just shills for the business. The business tells you to run in that direction through that wall, and by God, you are going to run in that direction through that wall and get the client to the other side without regard to the damage that might be caused to them or all these other stakeholders along the way. And of course, it's only the compliance people who would tell them no. But if you've built the right culture at an organization, which I think we have at Morgan Stanley, the lawyers and the compliance professionals all share a common goal, which is, on the first hand, to make sure the business gets executed, right? We're a for-profit enterprise. Our goal is to make money for our shareholders. On the other hand, the clear lesson, if you could boil the crisis down at, frankly, all banking institutions of the crisis, is that if you are incurring legal, regulatory, or reputational risk that is not understood, that has fat tail exposure to the firm, then you're actually not doing your job as what I would describe as a supporting role if it's legal. So we have all the scar tissue that you could possibly imagine at Morgan Stanley, billions of dollars worth of scar tissue at Morgan Stanley. We survived, which is great, and we sort of vowed as a management team to never let that happen again. And one way to at least help ensure that that doesn't happen again is to make sure that the lawyers and the compliance professionals all share that mission, and that they're all, you know, from the Hamilton line, all in the room where it happens. You got to be in the room where it happens. You got to make sure that your interaction with your business, and this is true for outside counsel as much as inside counsel, you got to make sure, and it's true for compliance professionals and the other, whether it's the risk function or other support functions, you got to make sure that you're understood to be a good partner. And you have to make sure that in the first line, the business guys, they understand that the expectations of the board and senior management is that they will take advice sometimes, which might be counterproductive to their goal of getting to the other side of that wall. And so we've built partnerships across the division where we have this shared goal. We have, as a management team, we draw up a list of goals for every year as a management team. And on the list every year that I've been in the job is no new mistakes. No new mistakes. And of course, and that means and mistakes are defined by your level of tolerance for mistakes. So if you're James Gorman, that might mean no new mistakes above a couple $100 million. Below, and then you just take that sort of threshold because mistakes get made all the time. It's no mistakes that threaten the enterprise or threaten a quarter or that put a business at risk. And then when you marry that up with the far more robust risk framework that we have in a bank, meaning just one's ability to put the firm at risk or put the firm's capital at risk is much more limited than it used to be. So whereas pre-crisis, the risk function, which guard against kind of market credit and operational risk, they probably had, 100 limits in terms of defining people's sandbox. And now we have thousands of limits. So, in your sandbox, frankly, there's just only so much damage you can do. And then if you bring other people like legal and compliance and risk into the sandbox with you when you're making your sandcastle, then the chances of something bad happen are much more limited.
You talked about, you mentioned John Mack there, obviously the former CEO, and James Gorman. I think people in the room would just be a little bit interested in someone in your role when you transition to new leadership, particularly forming this relationship of trust, whether there's an open door policy, having this say, being in the room where it happens. How have you sort of crafted your own career and your own path at Morgan Stanley to be able to sort of transition between leadership teams in an industry that does have a lot of turnover, but obviously strong personalities and.
Well, look, I think to succeed in jobs like mine, you have to be, first of all, you have to be a people person. You have to like people, like all kinds of people, and people are all, behave differently, and you kind of take your CEO in part as you find them. And so I enjoy engaging with people. I always have. When I was in outside counsel, I enjoyed spending time with my clients. Not every minute, not every second, and not on the receiving end of every phone call. But you have to just view life as an opportunity to interact with all kinds of different people, and to make sure that as best you can, you build relationships of confidence and trust with them. CEOs are no different. I've been fortunate in the two CEOs that I've had in my time at Morgan Stanley. Both know what they don't know, and both take advice. And that is a critical element to success in a job like mine. You have to have in the case of James Gorman, he went to law school in Australia, and he practiced. He was a litigator for a couple of years in Australia before he went to Columbia Business School and came to the States. And I in fact, just said this to him the other day. We had a town hall for the MDs and the managing directors in my division, and James came and spoke. And in the introduction, I said, I can't think of a time in 6.5 years where he even mentioned to me, in the context of a discussion or debate he and I were having about a legal issue, that he went to law school too, and he knows that that's not right, or that's not the end. He just never plays that card. He understands what he doesn't know, and doesn't mean that he won't engage me on legal issues, just like it doesn't mean I won't engage him on commercial issues, which I do all the time. Because one of the great things about the job that I have, again, back to what I think we've earned as a division at Morgan Stanley, is we have responsibility for sort of legal, regulatory, and what we call franchise or reputational risk and exposure. So the function at Morgan Stanley is responsible for organizing the answering of not just the can we do it question, but the should we do it question. And so we have all kinds of firm processes now to make sure that that question gets presented and answered by the right people, and the Legal and Compliance Division is responsible for managing the should we do it as much as the can we do it, which is a great honor.
Speaking of the can we do it, this room's going to talk a little bit more with the actual regulators. There has been a change of administration. There's also going to be more talk about that, as some people will have noticed. I want to know, just in terms of, not from a political perspective, but from the perspective of ramping up for changes in compliance, change in oversight, change in the intensity, change in the amount of staff, given how much you've bulked up in recent years. Just looking at that picture has become more complex in certain ways, less complex in certain ways, still too uncertain to tell. How are you managing the day-to-day in terms of looking at that?
You mean like right now, given this sort of
period?
Transitional, it's not quite an interregnum. It's, look, no one said, oh, by the way, you're no longer being supervised by, all those agencies I listed at the beginning. They're all very much there. And the way, for folks who work in big enterprises know, learned behavior, which is what we've watched over the last 6 years, penetrates its way down into an organization. And just by changing the folks at the top doesn't mean that people stop behaving differently. And so the line folks who we interact with day in and day out they're just continuing to do their thing. So there's nothing about like the day-to-day interaction with our U.S. regulators that has meaningfully changed right now. Is there a sense that the pendulum has at least stopped?
Yeah.
And what was remarkable, because I probably predicted on 3 or 4 occasions before 2016 that surely the regulatory pendulum is stopping. Sure, I'd be like, yeah, any day now. And then what we saw going into 2014 and 15 and 16 is that it just kept going, that the agenda in Washington amongst the prudential regulators was sort of the things that they were thinking about and asking us to do was not reaching its end. And I always sort of analogize it a little bit to like hurricane proofing. I always think about, for those who were here for Hurricane Sandy, was terrible. But if you remember, in the days after Hurricane Sandy, every day the New York Post had a different idea about how you could hurricane-proof New York. It was like, well, you could build this, $10 billion seawall outside the harbor, or remember the big corks to cork up all the tunnels and stuff like that. But you could put all the buildings on stilts if you wanted. That would help. You could just move New York somewhere to upstate New York, so if you take a lot of smart people and put them in a room and tell them they have a problem and tell them that's your job, then all they do is kind of think about more things they can do to hurricane-proof, in this case, the financial system. And so the folks in Washington were just sort of relentlessly thinking about only the safety part of the equation, not the soundness part. In my mind, they were not entirely, but were mostly focused on the safety aspect. How could they themselves put a stick in the ground and say, never again on our watch will the U.S. banking system lead to a crisis of that proportion. We're just not going to. And so we don't care if they're not profitable, which is really the soundness side of the equation. That's really not our issue. We'd have to make sure that they are not, that they are so safe that we never run any risk, and then to be mean about it, to say any risk so that we might be blamed for not doing our job as we were blamed during the crisis. So, and that just, at the end of the day, you can get, if you get so safe that you're not profitable and sound, then that creates a whole new risk in the system, right? And then you don't have the resources to spend on all the things that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and sound. So we were kind of approaching that place. The interesting thing was to watch what happened back to England. Whereas, out of the box there was so much scar tissue, PRA, FCA, and they were sort of very aggressively going after the banks. And then you had a change in leadership at the Bank of England with Mark Carney coming in, and I think a reassessment of like, well, hold on, wait a minute. Is this in the best interest of our system? And you saw not a complete pullback by any measure, but a sort of a more constructive approach. And I think we're on the cusp of a more constructive approach with our regulators here.
Two just pickups on that. One is, when you talk about a more constructive approach, do you think the American public is in a way ready to embrace now a less bank bashing mentality in terms of, do you think they understand this, which can be a very nuanced argument between regulation, too much regulation or not enough regulation?
I smile because the predicate is the notion that the American people agree on anything. And
well, they tend to agree on more regulation on banks, but...
Yeah, although they also agree that there needs to be more capital in the system, more lending. Lending promotes more growth, and all the major banks are carrying way more capital than they need to. And I think a more sensible approach would allow some of that capital to be put to work in the American economy. And I sense that there's probably at least a plurality of Americans who agree on that, as there is on the question of whether banks need to be watched closely. And we as an institution we're not advocating the repeal of Dodd-Frank. We think that would be a mistake. We think that there's a lot of good that came from Dodd-Frank in the way of transparency, certainly better resiliency planning around just rigor on things lessons learned from like Lehman Brothers. So, corporate separateness and sustaining your operations in the event of a crisis. Way more work obviously done on capital, liquidity. Our leverage ratios have all come to more sensible places. All that's very good, and we're not advocating that. But what we are advocating is, okay, look, it's been, 6 years since Dodd-Frank? Like, let's just stop and see if it's working. And all you have to do is look at the U.S. banks relative to the rest of the global financial system and realize we have the healthiest, strongest, best performing banks, because we all took our medicine early. We all carry much more capital, liquidity. We're smarter about all the things I talked about around risk management, compliance, things like that. And we're not still dealing with all the things that our foreign competitors, frankly, are still dealing with right now. And we should, and I advocated this a long time ago, the folks in Washington ought to take some credit for it. Put a flag in the ground and say, we have done a lot. And I think going into the sort of, for whatever reason, politics, I think, in my own view, being the biggest one, there was a hesitancy on lots of folks' part in 2015 and 16 to say, hey, the system's way better and we should let up a little bit because it didn't play well with at least some segment of the voting population. But the regulators were doing themselves a disservice because they'd been hard at work at this, and had done really, really good work for 5-6 years, but they never declared victory. So of course, now they're racing But the new guys are going to come in and take credit for all the work that was done by the guys before, and of course that's how Washington works.
It is how Washington works. Mission accomplished.
Yes,
I think everyone remembers that.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that. You're going to stay with us.